to another edition of Components Breakdown. Today we're going to look at one of the most difficult and challenging games that I've ever tried to teach myself, and that is the game known as Washington's War. Washington's War is a two-player game that takes about 90 to 120 minutes to play. And that time frame can vary drastically depending upon some of the cards that are drawn in the game that end the war game conditions quite earlier than expected. Now, the game at heart is really a war game. It's a tabletop game that has been condensed into a board game, in my opinion. It is a card-driven game, but there are numerous and varied mechanics that are used within the game. Now, those mechanics revolve around area control, area influence, card drafting, dice rolling, point-to-point movement system. It's a very challenging game to learn, and that has to do with just the very nature of the game itself, and for the fact that the rule sets, if anyone is familiar with GMT rules, they're not the easiest things to read, and they can quite easily put someone to sleep. But let's look inside the box, see what comes with the game, and I'm going to give you my interpretation of what I think about Washington's War. So in this components breakdown, we're going to spend a little more time on the components and just some basic thoughts on the game, and not really steer into the game too much, because quite honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the rules and understand all of the gameplay mechanics. Now, I have a real firm and good understanding of how the game plays, but I think this is one of those games that you just have to play and play and play like a Twilight Struggle to really understand how the game is driven. So let's look at the components first. The first thing you're going to notice is a very nondescript rulebook. Now, this is very typical of the GMT rulebooks that you see. Everything looks like an index with numbering systems that refer to different places all throughout the rulebook. It's not the easiest thing, nor is it the most enjoyable thing to read. It actually has put me to sleep numerous times. Now, this was a birthday present that I received on August the 2nd, 2010. And I just finally played my first pseudo game on Saturday of this past week, which is October. And I actually played a real game the next day. So it took me quite some time, not because the rules are overly difficult to understand. There are just a lot of them. There's a lot of rules, and it's not fun to read. Luckily, they come with this wonderful playbook inside here that gives you 2 turns of the game and describe each of the cards that are played, why they play those cards, and what they're used for, which gives you a really good understanding of how a typical play turn is played out from one turn to the next. There's also 2 of these reference cards that come in the game. They're nicely not laminated, but glossed, real thick cardstock, and they give you all the basic rule sets for the game: combat losses, combat resolution, die roll modifiers, battle references, ops cards, everything that you would need to know. Now, I would tell you that there is a better one that is on the Geek that I would print out, and I don't know the name of it. I apologize to the person that made it, but it's got about 160 some thumbs on it, so it's not that hard to actually find, and much better describes the game than these 2 that come with the game. One of the wonderful things about the game is this board, and it is a massive board, and if you look at it folded up, it's huge. That's it folded up. It folds out, I believe, 6 or 8 times. It's gigantic, and it's beautiful to look at, and we'll start looking at this in just a moment. Inside here, you get several different things. You get a stack of cards, or 2 stacks of cards, and there's no different kinds of decks. Everything goes into the strategy deck. Now, they're not the most wonderful looking cards, and that's typical for GMT games, but they're really nice, thick cardstock. They're all gloss, as you see the shine right there on it. Just really wonderfully made cards. There's several of these PC markers, which stands for political control, which are double-sided, which you'll be flipping to see who controls specific areas. Also, there's a couple in here that say operations queues, which you can queue up multiple ops cards to be able to bring or move generals in the game. There are several of these small components, which are little flags that are used to show who controls specific colonies within the game. And then there's generals. Now, there's 2 kinds of generals that ship with the game. There's these small ones that can be used, or there's larger ones that you can use on stands. Now, The preferable way is to use the stands, obviously, but some people don't like all the clutter from the stands, so they like to use the small ones. So they give you the option of both. Also inside here, you're going to find 2 dice, one for the British and one for the Americans. And you're going to find all of your combat units, and they come in 3 different varieties. There are the reds, which act as the British player. There are the blues, which are the Americans, and then there are green ones, which are the French. And the French will come in at particular spots within the game. So that's everything that ships with the game. Everything does fit back in this nicely printed insert. There's no compartmentalization in them, but as you saw, everything fit back in there nicely in baggies, which is a plus. So let's actually set up the game and give you some basic overview of how the game plays. I'm not going to get into a lot of the gameplay depth because it's way too long and too massive to understand, but we'll give you an idea of some basic stuff. So let's move forward. There's a lot of stuff to explain in this game, so we're going to go through it as briefly as possible. I'm not going to go over everything by any means, but I'm going to give you a basic idea of the game. There's just simply not enough time in this length of a video to do it. As I said, it is a card-driven game, very much like 1960 and Twilight Struggle, so it comes with a deck of cards. There's 110 cards in the deck, and I'm going to explain what the cards do here. There are several different types of cards. There are event cards that are enacted by particular factions, so the Americans could play this one, and the British could play this one. If you have the opposing player's card, you can do a couple things with it. You can discard it to modify your battles, or you can simply just discard it and hope that the American or British player doesn't have the right number of ops cards to dig it back out and play it as an event for them. There are battle cards, and they will change your dice roll modifiers. There's 2 kinds of campaigns, which allow you to enact or activate 2 or 3 generals, or to create a landing party for the British player. There are mandatory event cards, and there's 7 of these, which have to be played. You cannot discard them, nor can you use them as battle event cards. And it doesn't matter which player has them, they have to be played. Just like all the cards in your hand have to be played. And there are 1, 2, and 3 ops cards. These are the most prevalent cards in the deck, and they allow you to do a couple different operations. Either activate, move generals, or place PC markers onto the game board. The game board is broken into a couple different things. As you'll notice, there's 13 colonies on the board, and each of the colonies has a number system next to them. It simply states how many regions are within that colony. There is a winter attrition line, which affects winter attrition phase of the game. And there are 3 different types of areas on the board, and I have zoomed into all 3 of them. There are regular spaces, there are winter attrition boxes, and then there are fortified ports. And those all come into play at specific parts in the game. There are also ports in the game that are represented by the little port icon, and this allows the British to move freely from one port to the next as long as it's not blockaded by the French Navy. A couple different areas on the board of note. There is a captured general box at the top. There's the American and French reinforcement boxes along with the British reinforcement boxes. There's a nice little chart here on the right hand side that shows you at a glance who controls which specific area. There is a war ends box, which the card, whatever year the war is going to end in, is placed there. Now that can change as the game progresses. It can either move back in time or forward in time. There are 2 charts of note at the bottom. There is a French alliance track, which if this reaches the 9, the French army will then come into play, which is good for the American side. And then there is a game turn, which the game will either last a couple rounds or last all the way to 1783. There's also below this the number of British reinforcements that they'll be getting at the start of each of those turns. So the basic gameplay element consists of several different phases, and there's 7 phases of play in a typical game turn. The first is the reinforcement phase, upon which the British player will get reinforcements. And those are combat units and generals, which are represented by these little tokens here, and the general tokens that you see down here. There is the strategy card phase, in which each player is going to get 7 cards. They have to play or discard all 7 cards. None of them can be held on to the next turn. And then there's battle phases, which will happen during the strategy phase. I'm not going to get into battles, but they're quite in-depth. They include a lot of modifiers and a lot of dice rolling. There's the winter attrition phase, which if you're above the winter attrition line, you're going to take damage to your combat units. There's the French naval phase, so if they come into play, they can block ports from the British. The political control phase to see who controls different areas on the board, and then the end phase to see if the game ends. Now, the game can end in a couple different ways. The first way is if it ever reaches that year, the game will end. So if it ever reaches 1780, in this instance, the game will end. The player that has, if the British have 7 colonies in their control, they will win. If the Americans have 6, if the British have 6 and the Americans have 7, one of those two sides will win. The game can also end automatically if at any time the British or American side kill all the generals and combat units on the board, that player will win. So what do I think of the game? This is not for your spouse. This is not for somebody who is into light games. This is definitely a war game in a box, in a board game box. It's very in-depth. There are a lot of rules that I'm not even going to attempt to cover. Stuff like interception and retreating, and which armies can do it and which can't. Ports and die roll modifiers to ports as specific events are taking place. There's just a lot of stuff going on in the game. And it took me hours of reading to actually understand how the game plays. Now, I haven't even gotten into the strategies behind the game, when to use certain events, when to hold on to specific reinforcements, when to bring them into play, where to move them, why to intercept, why not to intercept. As I said, the game is very in-depth, and this is not for a layman gamer who just wants to pick up a nice light war game, because this is not it. This is something for somebody who likes their games meaty, strategic, and very in-depth. This is not to say the game is bad, because it is definitely not bad. It's actually excellent, but it's just challenging. It's challenging to learn. It's challenging to teach, especially since there's so many different nuances that you can say, oh, I'm 3 turns into it. I forgot to tell you that this can happen. And it's not something that you can give to a buddy and say, hey, learn this, and then come back to me and we'll play a game. You're going to have to teach this to someone, and it's not easy to teach. So, with that, if you're into war games, get this game. It's excellent. It's actually one of the best war games I have played. Very much on par with the War of the Ring for being as in-depth, maybe even more in-depth than something like that. Just know that you're going to be challenged reading the rule book, and you may fall asleep doing so. So, thanks again for watching.